All right. And welcome back, you guys, to the Self-Selecting Podcast. I am your host, Cory Hageman. Thank you for being here. Thank you for tuning in. Just recorded an amazing episode with the beautiful Jasmine Shire talking about the figure division, talking about her turning pro, and ultimately her plan to get back on stage. At the time y'all are getting this episode, probably won't get that episode for a few more weeks, because I think, now that I'm like pulling back into my brain, I think that's going to be after this one. This topic today is highly requested, not just on YouTube, but on Patreon too. So we'll see. I kind of debated as I was getting set up, making my drinks in between recordings. I was like, do I want this to release as a Patreon only? It's for sure going to come out on YouTube, but I was debating. I'm like, maybe it's going to be an early release on Patreon. Maybe we're going to do it that way. We'll see. We'll see what I do. I too am curious. So with all that being said, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for the love, the support on the guest episodes. Let me just say real quick. So the episode with Rid Path just came out. You guys loved that. Was really, really impressed. The amount of you that were like, yo, like this completely revamped my training and made it to where I have just so much now to think about. Same kind of response when it came to the episode with Allison. Hers was much more heartfelt than I would say like most of the guest episodes that I have, because at the time I recorded that one, gosh, that had to be early March. At this point, she's now qualified for the Olympia, which is so amazing. That's exciting. But at the time, I remember, like, even outside of recording, like, we were just talking off air, and just the doubt around whether or not she was ever going to make it back. So you guys have really been great in terms of letting her feel appreciated. So I just want to say, as like a facilitator, as like the host, I'm like, thank you for being so positive. Thank you for being always so respectful to the guests that I have on, and grateful. Like, I feel like there is a lot of gratitude that comes through in the comments. So as always, if there's someone that you're like, hey, I don't know. I don't know why this person hasn't been on, or I'd like to have them on, please let me know in the comments down below. As always, if you are tuning in from YouTube, like, comment, subscribe, turn the bell notification on. I'm gonna power through this today. At the time of recording, I have had that one sickness for maybe 10 days now. And this is the first day that, I mean, like, let me just be honest. My voice still very nasally. Trying to eat breakfast this morning with Jordan. I was like, I don't think I should be recording. Like, I don't think anyone wants to hear this. And gosh, the solo episode we did, not solo episode, the Patreon episode we did yesterday, was a real, I want to say it was a dumpster fire, but the actual content itself was really good. I just sounded like, vocally, I sounded like a dumpster fire. So hopefully this is the tail end of it. That's just what it is. Just excited to be healthy again and to be able to breathe and to not be leaking, especially every time I go to talk. That has made it really challenging on the calls. All that to say, yes, I do offer one-time consultation. So usually I save that for the closeout. But if you're someone who already has a coach and you're like, hey, I'm in a good situation, I like them, we've been working together for a long time, they know my body, but you're like, I don't think that they really do the PED thing, or I don't think they do the lab work thing, or even the training thing, this would be a good opportunity to book a one-time consult. You are not locked into any kind of contract, any kind of agreement. 45 to 60-ish minutes. I can go over whatever you'd like. A lot of people find this useful and find it as a nice compliment, especially if they're already in, like, the groove, and if they're making that transition to become an enhanced athlete, or in the case that, you're here because you're wondering if you are experiencing anovulation, amenorrhea, perimenopause, or menopause. That would also be a good use of that consultation. So that is what we're talking about today. This topic is one that a lot of people, they come to me, and it's interesting because like I hear initially on their intake, I hear the label they assign. I'm going through perimenopause, I'm postmenopausal, I'm experiencing functional amenorrhea, I've been anovulatory. And when it comes down to understanding the differences between all of these, in some cases symptoms, or system diseases, system disorders, yeah, no, that's better, disease processes, then yeah, it kind of matters in terms of defining these clearly. So that's what we're covering. I'm gonna do my best to power through this. I'm gonna do this. This is gonna be a good one. There's no worries. But especially in these athletic circles, and really the demographic of you, the individuals who are very focused on improving their health, improving their physique, and are finding that they're not really getting that same kind of attention to detail from their provider, from their OB. I think it's helpful to understand these differences, and why not dedicate an entire episode to really clarifying these conditions, because there is a lot of confusion about what's going on in your body, and with confusion can come mismanagement, misdiagnosis, taking interventions and strategies that frankly have no place. And we also have to think relative to long term. What are your goals? And is this strategy actually suitable for your physique goals, for your competition goals, if you have those? Each condition we're going to discuss today can have distinct implications on your health, on your training, on your ability to build muscle, on your quality of life. So I'm going to do my best to kind of define each of these, explain really the unique hormonal patterns, symptoms, and implications of why differentiating them ultimately matters. Now, I'm also going to touch on a few misconceptions so that you can ensure or be better equipped, I'll say minimally, to have an understanding of what each of these means. So let's go ahead and dive in. First and foremost, when we talk about anovulation, that means that you're not releasing an egg. So the release of the egg, that is ovulation during a cycle. Now, you still might experience bleeding, but here's that critical, distinct marker. These bleeds, so the actual periods, the menstruation, they're not true menstrual periods. These are typically withdrawal bleeds triggered by fluctuating estrogen levels without the progesterone rise and fall that comes with ovulation. So you might have regular or irregular cycles, but there's no ovulation actually happening. So this is something I see time and time again. People will come to me and tell me like, hey, I have a consistent period almost every month, roughly around the same time, even throughout a contest prep. But when it really comes down to it, they don't have the lab work to really support that rise and fall of estrogen and progesterone. So why does this happen? Now, anovulation, it can happen for a number of reasons. It's not I guess we can't tie it back to, you diet too long, you diet too hard, but it's globally due, it can be due to experiencing being put under chronic stress, inadequate calorie intakes, excessive training, also PCOS, hormonal imbalances in the case of PCOS, like elevated androgens or insulin resistance. So all this to say, in layman's terms, you still might have that monthly bleed, and you can assume everything's fine, but without ovulation, you are not having that same degree, that same quality of a menstrual period. That can oftentimes explain, the mood swings, poor sleep, poor recovery, or in the cases of experiencing shifts in your physique that, I'll kind of get into hormonally why they occur. I would say a lack of progress or muddying of progress. So it's important to be aware, like even with the period, it doesn't guarantee that you're ovulating, but a period is a good indication. Like a period is way better than no period. If you're not having a period, you're definitely not ovulating, which brings us to our next point, amenorrhea. Now, this does have a varying degree of causes. Now, also, I want to jump back to anovulation. Notice how it's like chronic stress, inadequate calorie intake, excessive training. Like these are very abstract causes. It's not to say like, oh, you went under 1,200 calories and that was inadequate. Like, cool, just don't do that. We don't have these hard lines in the sand to work within. And even under like the aspect of chronic stress, like there is a component to stress that very much is perceived. And really it's like you have total allostatic load, but that includes perceived stress as well as real stress. So true threats to your being, to your safety, and then it's how you manage intrinsically those stressors. So some people will turn molehills into mountains. Am I saying that right? Yeah. They will create stress out of anything. It doesn't matter how comfortable, like someone else might be like, hey, that's like not that bad. You should be able to handle that. So that's where, as a coach, as an athlete, it's really important to get a pulse on your ability to manage stress. It's not necessarily to grade, like, are you actually stressed? It's like, okay, how much does the stress that you have, whatever that amount is, affect you? And how stressed out do you actually get? Are the highs incredibly high and the lows really low? And is it very volatile? And are those high bouts in high frequency as well? Now, I said no period, way worse than having a period but not ovulating. Enter amenorrhea. Now, amenorrhea literally means absence of menstruation, but it's important to understand it's not a disease in itself, but this is oftentimes something that's kind of thrown around as more of a permanent state, like I'm amenorrheic, or I guess you could even say in that case, like it's a descriptive of a state that you're in, but rather the absence of the period, like being experiencing amenorrhea, that is truly just a symptom signaling something deeper. Now, when we look at the types of amenorrhea, you have primary and secondary. Now, primary amenorrhea, you've never had a period by age 15 to 16, and this is oftentimes genetic, anatomical. It can be like externally induced in the case that like you do start a synthetic form of hormonal birth control. In that case, like if you start that at an age where you've gone through very few periods in your life, or maybe you've had, a couple of them, or maybe you've had just a couple of them, but now introducing this, this causes this state, this chronic state of primary amenorrhea. I guess technically if you've had a period, that would fall into secondary. So let me eat my words here. In the case where you've been put on hormonal birth control prior to starting your period or at the age of puberty, which is not necessarily uncommon. Like I've heard of individuals who, let's say, weren't getting their period, so the induction was, hey, let's put you on hormonal birth control, maybe not to cause the period to come, but just to prevent pregnancy. Let me move into secondary amenorrhea because I think this will make a lot more sense. You've previously menstruated, but now cycles have stopped for 3 or more months. Now, in the case that this was also happening right at the age of puberty, there could be some overlap in terms of how this is diagnosed, and I'm not necessarily going to get as deep into that, but more so when I'm talking about secondary amenorrhea, I'm speaking to the individual who has had, let's say, relatively a healthy cycle throughout their life, and now they're in this state where they've missed 3 or more periods. That would be secondary amenorrhea. Now, that already gives us a distinction between having a period, not having a period, and then the causes behind that. Now, amenorrhea can also be caused by stress, low calories, exercise, but we do tend to look a little bit deeper here at PCOS, potential thyroid dysfunction, pituitary disorders like prolactinomas. If we look closer at genetic factors, there can be testing that we can do as well, but it really does come down to the context in which this started. Did it start, let's say, if we can classify it truly as primary amenorrhea, where the individual was not menstruating before? It might warrant, looking a little bit deeper into other levels or genetic testing. Whereas with secondary amenorrhea, it's not to say that you shouldn't look at genetic testing if you never had it done. But typically, in my experience, what I found is that we can walk this back and typically find a culprit. But it's not to say that you wouldn't test for your prolactin, different aspects of your thyroid and metabolic function. And in the case that you have experienced some kind of excess androgen or insulin resistance, and in that case, a combination of both, even looking at something like a diagnosis of PCOS. But keep in mind, there are very distinct means in which, or I guess criteria in which we diagnose PCOS. So when we look at functional hypothalamic amenorrhea, FHA, it's very common in athletes. And we're going to talk about one of the predominant drivers, also another state that an athlete can enter, but this is specifically caused by chronic stress, under eating, overtraining, leading to the hypothalamus. I've talked about it before, to kind of like take the keys away or ground the kid in the way that like your body's just like, you can't be trusted to reproduce because you're not taking care of yourself to begin with. The idea is let's halt reproduction to conserve energy. So I've made the analogy before, it's kind of like strict parents. For some people, they don't have to get that low in calories or body fat or do that much exercise to experience these periods of cessation in terms of their cycle. Others, they can take themselves pretty deep in terms of getting to a low body fat. They can get to pretty low calories. They can, what many might consider, overtrain and kind of be left unscathed. So that's where we really have to do obviously a very comprehensive medical workup on like, what is this individual's history? Has this been, in the case it's secondary amenorrhea, has this been an ongoing problem? But in plain speak, no periods, it means that your body's protecting yourself. It's not a good thing. And typically this is the start. I would say it can be the start of potentially more serious problems. So it's definitely not something to ignore. Even if you're getting a bleed, I would still be very adamant if you're exposing yourself to these states of chronic stress, especially in the case of like bodybuilding or getting to low body fats. I would be very adamant that we should get these levels checked to ensure there actually is ovulation occurring. So what about perimenopause? Now, this is a transitional phase before menopause, and it usually does start in your late 30s to mid 40s. And we can characterize this by increasingly irregular cycles. So even within that, we can establish patterns and trends if we have that information. It's also characterized by hormonal fluctuations and then changing ovulatory patterns. So if you're someone who does see that like, hey, I know when I'm ovulating because I present with these symptoms, and you start noticing your follicular and your luteal phases, these time frames are changing. Like it's taking, like your follicular phase is taking a longer amount of time, or it's shorter, or your PMS is getting increasingly worse. Let's say your luteal phase is diminishing. It's getting shorter. Or you're having bouts where there just are blatant irregularities. Some months are really short, some months are really long. You're not seeing a lot of continuity. Now, the root cause comes down to natural ovarian aging. Now, this is also like in combination with diminished ovarian reserve. So while we can test AMH and we can get an idea of kind of where you sit, it's important to remember that like AMH, anti-Müllerian hormone, it's important to remember that in isolation isn't a means to diagnose perimenopause or diminished ovarian reserve in that case. So while training and diet, that in itself doesn't directly cause perimenopause, chronic stress, sustained energy deficits can exacerbate these symptoms and sometimes even accelerate the onset. So I've seen this largely too with individuals who start to experience just like a plummet in their hormonal function, especially late 20s, early 30s, mid 30s, who all this to say, I guess simply said, are just not taking very good care of their hormones. They're just beating the shit out of their body. They're not doing a lot that is hormonally protective. And one of these things that I'm talking about is perma-dieting, being in a fat loss phase, very low, being in a very like restrictive state, calorically speaking, not like in terms of food selection necessarily, but in terms of the amount of energy they're consuming versus the amount of energy they're burning. If you're on this cycle of doing this years on end, decades on end, you could be exacerbating those symptoms of decreased hormonal function, but then also you could increase really the onset of this happening fully. So when we look in like, I don't know, in layman's terms, like perimenopause means that you're naturally transitioning towards menopause. And hormonally, these fluctuations, like they will manifest as unpredictable periods, mood swings, sleep disruptions, and variance performance levels. Now, you can manage some of these symptoms with lifestyle and training modifications, but we kind of have to do a workup in terms of the history. Like, is this a result of what you've been doing to your body for the last 5 to 10 years? And that's where I think we can make a pretty big distinction between someone who's experiencing perimenopause versus anovulation versus amenorrhea. Now, in the case that someone is experiencing maybe even a combination, like they haven't been perma-dieting and they generally go through, I don't want to call them health phases, but phases that are non-dieting phases, essentially phases that are a little more restorative. These are things that will give you insight into whether or not we can slow that natural aging process down. But I think that's really like the thing I want to hit on the nose here is that like perimenopause is aging, like it is ovarian aging, and it is very expected. It's natural, but the rate in which this can happen and when this can occur, it can happen much sooner in some individuals. And even in the case that someone hasn't been beating the shit out of their body, or maybe they don't feel as if they've taken good care of their hormones thus far, it doesn't necessarily pigeonhole you into, okay, you know, I'm turning 38, like I'm going to start to experience these symptoms. But without lab work, it's really, really hard to know. And this isn't, again, one that we just want to get one value drawn. We want to have a comprehensive view. And I largely want to see like DHEA and pregnenolone. I want to make sure that like further up in the cascade that these things are not slowly declining. And it's even better if we have some kind of reference point, especially at a state where the individual was, let's say, under chronic stress or in a pretty extreme fat loss phase. If we can see like that's what that person's low is at versus even if we're comparing a low to a low where they're also in, you know, let's say a state of caloric restriction, it's still helpful in providing that context. But that's largely what I'm trying to say about this, is that it's not something we can necessarily avoid in entirety, but I think it's really important early on, especially in someone's 20s, 30s, and 40s, if they have the means to be prophylactic in simply just taking care of their hormones and supporting their hormonal health, they very much should. Now, what about menopause? This is oftentimes convoluted, and people will think very early on that they're going through menopause, when in reality they might be experiencing a time of amenorrhea. They might be missing 3 or more consecutive cycles. They might be having irregularities in their periods. They might be going through perimenopause, but it's important to distinctly define, like, menopause is a permanent cessation of menstruation, and clinically it's defined as 12 consecutive months with no period. Now, it's not a dysfunction or disease. That's a really important distinction to make. It is natural. It's something that all women will go through at some point in their life. Now, it is a universal phase of life marked by these significant reductions in sex hormones, specifically estrogen and progesterone, but we are going to see this translate across the board to majority of your hormones. Now, why does this actually happen? When we look at ovarian follicular reserve, this becomes taxed, it becomes exhausted causing permanently lowered hormone levels. So you just have naturally less levels of these circulating hormones. Now, this is why in the case that someone has entered menopause either surgically or through like medical induction, like through pharmacology, we should be supporting hormonal status. Now, maybe not to the extent that some are. It's not to say like, oh, they're not making any tests, so we need to put TRT in at 50 milligrams a week and have them in like sort of male territory. But at that point, that individual is not going to regain ovarian reserve. They're not going to have the same capacity to produce these hormones. So I think it makes a lot of sense, especially in the case that for the individual it lines up, that they have these precursor hormones in place that can then be converted down into, synthesized down into a plethora of other hormones as well. So it really does come down to where the deficiencies are, and naturally what does the lack of certain hormones manifest as for certain individuals. But I do think that in the case that someone is at that biological age for menopause, or it's been induced artificially, we do need to offer some kind of support, because just having someone hit triple zeros for test estrogen, progesterone, as well as FSH, LH, it's like they're not going to feel good. There's going to be symptoms, and realistically, I think for most people, this is going to have a hindrance on their quality of life. All this to say, menopause, it is a permanent hormonal shift, and it can be managed. It can be supported as it should be. But the age in which this is happening can vary greatly person to person. Now, it is very tempting to attribute all symptoms like mood swings, anxiety, poor sleep to hormonal status. But we do have research that emphasizes it's not always hormones alone. Lifestyle, inflammation, nutrition, sleep quality, stress management, and sociocultural factors also significantly influence how you feel. And this is where we walk the conversation back to allostatic load. There are individuals who find even when hormones are, on the upper end or within range, like to an extent that, on paper they should look optimal, they very much might not feel optimal. They might not feel great. And even when you look in the, silo of individuals who are androgen dominant, maybe not in the clinical sense of like PCOS, but who are more prone to experience like darker facial hair growth, acne, we do need to be careful in how we go about correcting aspects of anovulation, aspects of perimenopause or menopause, because the right protocol might, how do I want to say this? Just because it is the right protocol for one person doesn't mean that it's going to be the right protocol for another, which is just very cliche, I'll admit. But I think that's where we have to really weigh what we have from a quantitative standpoint on labs, largely against how this individual feels and what they're trying to achieve. But I do think that ultimately this is where we need to look at perimenopause, menopause for those individuals who are going through what we absolutely can, say are expected aging cycles in life. Specifically, how is this affecting their quality of life? What tools do we have at hand to slow this process down or correct this process? And is this something that, in the case, like if I give someone a recommendation or if someone goes to a clinic and they get a prescription from a doctor, what is the associated risk if the individual never comes back to that clinic or that provider or that coach, if they continue following that protocol? So in plain speak, layman's terms, what I'm trying to say by that is if you have an individual who's going through perimenopause, which this is 90% of the calls that I get, an individual who's now working with the clinic, they are put on, in some cases, they're put on fucking Anavar. Like they're put on Anavar for their perimenopause indefinitely. Like that's just the protocol that they've been assigned or prescribed. And realistically, it's insane to me because I always look at the recommendations I give for my athletes. Like, it's not medical advice, but I, frame it like, if it were me, here's what I would do. And I always look at it through the lens of if this person were to leave me next week and not take the follow-up labs that I recommend and not check in with me again, how safe would they actually be? And a more conservative approach I find is, ethically what you owe clients. And as clients, that's what you should be looking for, because you can always be more aggressive for the most part. But realistically, if you start aggressive, you're not really setting yourself up for a lot of lateral mobility. And in the case of androgens, if we're talking about someone who is experiencing these symptoms of, decreased performance, decreased ability to build muscle mass, even just like overall having a loss of sense of self, having lower libido, it typically isn't just one hormone that's the culprit of these symptoms. It's very dynamic by nature. And in a lot of cases, individuals, I wouldn't even say it comes from a laziness on the client's part, but it's just the fact that the systems aren't in place on the medical side to really set someone up for success so that they can start, let's say, a low dose of TRT or low dose of DHEA to further slow the onset of perimenopause, and ultimately see improvements in their symptomology on account of also they're receiving dietary counseling and they're put on some kind of training program that does support their goals. But I see this happen time and time again, where individuals will come to me terrified to eat a little bit more, terrified to do less cardio, not really understand that the deficit that they're creating is actually really hindering their hormonal state, and that it's not to say fat loss in itself is evil or fat loss in itself is the culprit, but there does need to be a balance in how we approach these fat loss phases. It can't just be all or nothing. It can't just be put yourself in this extreme deficit until you like how you look. And the more imbalanced your hormones become, the more suppressed they become, and really the less ovarian reserve that you have, the more important it is to maybe zoom out a little bit and consider like, okay, I'm working really hard to not like how I look. Part of why I don't like how I look is because I feel like dog shit. I feel like garbage. Like I don't feel like myself at this point. And even though I'm putting in a lot of effort, there is little to no return. And part of that is largely, a big part of that is stemming from the fact that everything that I'm doing is kind of working in this feedback loop where now my body is under the impression that I can't reproduce. I can't be trusted with that responsibility on account of me not taking care of it. So as holistic as it might sound and very like functional specialist, I mean this in a way like, let's walk this backwards and find the culprit. And if the culprit truly is that you're dieting too hard, you're not giving yourself time to be in a state that is very hormone supportive, this very well we could frame it as like, this is very low hanging fruit. This could be an easy lever for you to pull. And in a lot of cases, that fear that's driving the hesitation in the client to not want to come out of the deficit comes from, deep-seated beliefs that if I'm not dieting or if I'm not doing this amount of cardio, then I'm going to get fat. And that's where I think like the approach does need to be strategic, especially if the individual is experiencing any kind of thyroid dysfunction. But it needs to be, at the pace that the client can slowly develop that buy-in into the process of this restorative phase. And lastly, what I'll just say on it not being hormonally driven, because I know that's how we started that last section. And then I kind of ended it with saying like, well, your hormones are suppressed and that also is not helping now your lifestyle. Just understanding the fact that there are lifestyle factors that can exacerbate the decline in the suppression of these hormones. And the biggest one is largely going to be sleep. And then second to that is, I'm going to say, nutrition. But if we look at this globally as like, okay, what is that manifesting as? If you're not sleeping well, you're going to have elevated stress. Your allostatic load of stress is going to be higher than if you slept well. If you're eating like garbage, or in the case you're not eating like garbage, but you're not fueling nearly enough, it's more than likely that you're going to accelerate that onset of ovarian reserve insufficiency or ovarian reserve decline. So just to make sure we're all on the same page we've got anovulation. That is regular or irregular bleeding without true ovulation. So you're getting a period, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting that rise and fall of estrogen and progesterone each month. Now, there typically is a hormonal imbalance, and you could even say potentially subtle to more apparent shifts in mood and recovery with this. But this is definitely something to not ignore. It can probably be a little harder to catch because oftentimes people, don't really know when to get curious, when to raise the alarm, when to talk to their provider. What I recommend for anyone who falls on the spectrum of irregularities in their cycle or in their symptoms associated with their cycle, or even in performance. If you are skeptical and suspicious that you might be experiencing hormonal imbalance, get very clear on how long your cycles are. So I would start by tracking your cycle with the Flow app. So day one is the first day of your bleed. Being irregular most of my life, I can tell you that I was very skeptical using the Flow app. I didn't think it was going to be as accurate as it is. But now, having used it for 7 years, I can say that it's really insightful in the sense I can almost predict to the day when I'm going to get my period, as well as what symptoms I'm going to get in and around ovulation and then post-ovulation. And for me, that was paramount in uncovering that at one point I was very estrogen dominant. So I think that can be helpful to have a very accurate log. And I really like their interface. I forget, I think it's 20, maybe $25 a month. So it is it's not $2 a month or $5 a month, but I find that app to be very well worth it in that sense. It lets you log all sorts of symptoms, physical symptoms, emotional swings, and I do think that it gets pretty consistent in terms of then predicting when your next cycle and when your next cycle is going to be, but then also what symptoms you should expect around different points of your cycle. So when we look at amenorrhea, complete lack of menstruation. Now, this is a significant red flag, and it often is pointing to a deeper issue. Even in the case that this is medically induced due to hormonal birth control, we need to take a closer look at it. And I'll just say, this was something I covered with Jasmine in the episode today, is that individuals who flex on not getting a period, I get it. I hate getting, let me back this up. Getting my period each month is not fun. It's very annoying and it feels very inconvenient. Yes. And then the actual being on your period, also super inconvenient, it feels like. But if we were to reframe this almost like getting a cycle and having these fluctuations in hormones, that in itself is the epitome of health. That is the equivalent of your check engine light not coming on each month. That's what we want to see. We want to see that there is a natural ebb and flow of these hormones. And oftentimes I think providers can finesse you into thinking even though it is annoying, it's not that important. And it's a shame, because sustained states of amenorrhea, or in this case, just not getting a period on account of being on hormonal birth control for majority of your life, or even from an age where it's so early into puberty or into getting cycles that your body doesn't really have a chance to know what an actual cycle is, to acclimate to that. And this is one Victoria Felker and we talked about in our podcast several months ago, but I know she's talked about it very openly, is that there are women who are started so early on these synthetic hormones that ultimately when they try to get off, they have a really gnarly time on account of their body has never had to be resourceful. It's never had to be reliant on that endogenous signaling. And if this is you, that might sound terrifying. That might be something I don't want to experience, but just know that the suppression of these hormones, you can pay for, how do I want to say this? You can pay the tax, you can pay your debt on it now by getting off the hormonal birth control and, going through maybe, a little bit of a murky time where things are up and down or things are irregular, or you can pay the tax or debt on that later, because we do see a strong correlation with amenorrhea, so not getting a period, or anovulation, not having an ovulatory cycle, we do see a high correlation between that and issues with fertility. So this is very much, to come full circle, why I recommend, like, in states of contest prep, I'm like, if we're talking about, like, the risk of PEDs in contest prep and how that might affect fertility, we also have to remember contest prep in itself will affect fertility. Like that in itself, it's not like, well, if you use PEDs, it's going to be that much worse. It really comes down to the effect that your prep has on you, and in this case, your cycle. Perimenopause, that is a natural aging related hormonal fluctuation that does precede menopause. And once it starts happening, we do need to be aware that if you also are of biological age where we would anticipate this, we can slow it down, but menopause will happen. And menopause is that permanent cessation of periods, consistently lower hormones. That is going to impact all of your systems, not limited to metabolic function, bone density, and performance. Listen, I know we covered a lot today, but this clarity really matters, and understanding exactly what's happening hormonally as well as physiology is critical for an accurate diagnosis. You can't manage what you can't measure. And yes, there are overlapping symptoms of menopause, perimenopause, amenorrhea, and just symptoms of just shitty PMS, like extreme PMS, PMDD. But we have to get very granular with the inputs that are in place that could be driving these irregularities. And that's where, like, it will gladly be the person to tell you that, like, the perma dieting, the excess cardio, the extreme contest preps, the AI use, the tamoxifen, the anything that's going to cause suppression of your hormones, the anabolics, those are all things that will have an impact on your ability to have an ovulatory cycle. So that's where I would rather take the approach globally, where if we're going to do things that predispose you to anovulation, amenorrhea, then we need to understand that risk. We need to understand how that factors into family planning. And if you're at an age where perimenopause is relatively expected, if you are older than 35, like, we could generally say, like, it could be happening in the next 10 to 15 years. This is something that we need to pay attention to. I think the definitions are important because they often get thrown around, and then people, I don't think they do it out of any other reason than they were told that they have this diagnosis. But remember, none of these conditions are normal sacrifices to feeling good in your skin, having agency and autonomy over your body composition. There's signals, and sometimes they can very well be subtle. Sometimes they can be incoherent. I don't like how I phrase that. They can oftentimes go completely missed, but it is a sign. It is a sign that your body needs attention. So please listen closely. As I've discussed in previous episodes, the labs I would recommend getting done: a CBC, a CMP, a lipid panel with ratios, DHEA, pregnenolone, testosterone, free testosterone, SHBG, DHT, estradiol, progesterone, cortisol, TSH, free T4, free T3. Those are ones that I do have a video that is already out at this point, 21 labs you should order, where I go into each and every one of those, what they are. Maybe I don't go into DHT, but I go into each and every one of most of those, explaining why they're relevant, what those hormones do. I also have a ton of videos out, medium format, longer format, where I explain essentially what each hormone does, its relevance, and how too high or too low can be a problem. But you guys, I hope this was helpful. This was highly, highly requested. Thank you so much for letting me know that this is what you want to talk about today. Once again, I apologize for my nasally voice. Hopefully it's better for the next one. As always, I will see you in the next one.